In the 75 years of its existence, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, has proven to be history's most successful military alliance. It was NATO that helped end the Cold War without direct military confrontation between superpowers and without a single shot fired. It was NATO that ushered in an era of peace and stability in the Balkans after its decisive intervention in the conflict of the 90s. It was NATO that made the successful global war on terrorism possible following the September 11 attacks. And it was NATO that has finally proven that Russia isn't invincible. Talk about a legacy. But why does the last achievement warrant a place of such significance in NATO's history? It's because Russia's perceived invincibility has been the cornerstone of its military strategy and political influence. It was only a few years ago that Russia's President Vladimir Putin declared Russia stronger than any other country in the world. His exact words were, "We can say with certainty, we are stronger now than any potential aggressor, anyone." This aggressive posturing allowed Russia to get away with annexing Crimea, supporting separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, and intervening in Syria without any significant consequences. But after Russia brutally and illegally invaded Ukraine, NATO has seemingly decided that enough is enough. The alliance backed Ukraine with unwavering resolve, sending a clear message to Russia: there is someone stronger. As the war in Ukraine raged on, it became clear that Putin was the one who should fear a clash with NATO, not the other way around. As one columnist puts it, going against NATO would be political and military suicide for Putin. But what did NATO do exactly to show Putin he was treading on dangerous ground? It's simple really. The alliance stopped Russia in all domains, military, political, and economic. For every Russian action, there was a response, moves and countermoves. With this in mind, let's explore how Russia learned a valuable lesson: don't mess with NATO. To understand just how vital NATO's role in the war in Ukraine has been, let's take you back to the beginning of the Russian invasion. Putin's initial strategy was to seize Kyiv within the first 2 days of the campaign. That's how much he underestimated Ukraine and its allies, and how much confidence he had in Russia's military might. It seems that he, too, bought into his own propaganda. But 2 years later, Kyiv is still standing. Ukraine has not only defended its territory, but also dealt some devastating blows to the Russian forces. Of course, Ukraine only managed to do so thanks to the unwavering support of NATO and its allies. Now, Ukraine isn't a NATO member, at least not yet. This means that the alliance can't establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine or send in NATO troops to battle Russia, but it can, however, send aid. Sending aid to Ukraine was NATO's first message to Russia. We can and we will stand against your aggression, no matter the cost. And this wasn't some sort of an implied message. In November 2022, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, said loud and clear, "NATO will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will not back down." When Russia started devastating Ukraine's military capabilities, NATO responded by providing Ukraine with more weapons, more training, and more intelligence. Here are just some of the notable military systems and equipment Ukraine has received from NATO since the beginning of the invasion. Western-made Iris-T air defense systems, US-made Patriot missile defense systems, US-made FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, Norwegian advanced surface-to-air missile systems, NASAMS, Soviet-designed 9K-32 Strela manpads, US-made M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, US-made M270 multiple launch rocket systems, US-made AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, AMRAAMs, US-made AGM-88 HARM air-to-surface anti-radiation missiles, US-made Harpoon missiles, US-made M1 Abrams main battle tanks, German Leopard 2 main battle tanks, US-made FGM-148 Javelin anti-tank systems, UK-made M777 howitzers, French Caesar howitzers, German Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, Canadian Stryker armored fighting vehicles, US-made Bradley fighting vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition of various calibers, artillery rounds, and mortar rounds. Ukraine is also expecting dozens of US-made F-16 Fighting Falcon jets to arrive in 2024 from countries like Denmark and the Netherlands. These advanced fighter jets could finally give Ukraine air superiority, which Russia has held since the beginning of the invasion, although not too convincingly. Though not all of the US-made weapons we've listed were given to Ukraine by the US, this country is still Ukraine's #1 military aid donor by a margin. Of course, the US is also the most prominent member of NATO, which goes to show that NATO as a whole has been instrumental in helping Ukraine resist Russia. Now, there are some fears that the US's involvement in NATO might significantly lessen if Donald Trump gets re-elected for president in November 2024. Trump's former national security advisor John Bolton even believes that he might pull the US out of NATO altogether if he wins, putting NATO in real jeopardy. That's why many experts believe Putin wants and needs Trump to win. But the bad news for Putin and the skeptics is that NATO can hold its own even without the US's involvement. After all, we're looking at a coalition of over 30 countries, some of which, like the UK, Germany and France, have enviable military capabilities and a strong commitment to NATO's collective defense. This was also proven through the aid to Ukraine, as the European Union countries provided the most military, financial and humanitarian aid combined. We're talking over $92 billion in aid, most of which was financial. In comparison, the US has committed over $70 billion in financial and military aid alone. For its part, NATO is primarily helping coordinate requests for aid and the delivery of the aid itself, both humanitarian and non-lethal. However, as of 2024, there have been proposals for the alliance to take on a more significant role in coordinating military assistance as well. But NATO's most important role in delivering aid to Ukraine is guaranteed by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. The article unequivocally states that an armed attack against one NATO member will be considered an attack against them all. This article thus gives Ukraine's allies peace of mind that they won't diminish their own security by helping the warring country. Most importantly, this aid isn't a one-and-done type of assistance. NATO allies have committed to supporting Ukraine in the long run, helping the country transition from Soviet era to NATO standards. This brings us to another crucial way NATO has demonstrated its superiority over Russia by taking Russia's perceived enemies and potential targets under its wing. Russia has historically used NATO expansion as a justification for its aggressive actions, claiming it needs to protect itself from the alliance. So what did NATO do? Expand more, of course. Despite Russia's vehement opposition, the country's neighbors Finland and Sweden joined the alliance on April 4, 2023 and March 7, 2024 respectively. In an even bigger slap to Russia's face, NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg reiterated that the door to membership in the alliance remains open to all, including Ukraine. Ukraine's accession to NATO was already agreed upon at the 2008 Bucharest summit, but for this accession to take place, Ukraine has to complete two steps. Number 1, Ukraine must submit an application to the Membership Action Plan (MAP), NATO's comprehensive assessment of the country's political, economic and military capabilities. Number 2, Ukraine must resolve any ongoing conflicts and territorial disputes. Step 1 was achieved at the 2023 Vilnius summit. This essentially means that Ukraine is free to join NATO once the war with Russia ends. But why does Ukraine's potential accession to NATO matter? It matters because this potential accession is one of the reasons Russia attacked Ukraine in the first place. By still keeping the door open to Ukraine, NATO has taken a resolute stand for freedom and security in the face of tyranny. The open door is not just an invitation, it's a clear message to those like Russia who would seek to divide and conquer. Your actions won't go unchallenged. Plus, let's not forget, if Ukraine were to join NATO, Russia would be fully surrounded by NATO members in Europe. Finland and Sweden's accession have already brought NATO's land borders with Russia to an impressive 754 miles. So if Russia was to go against NATO, it wouldn't battle it out with one militarily inferior country like it did with Ukraine. It will be looking at a formidable coalition that has unprecedented land access to its territory. Ironically, this is precisely what Putin wanted to prevent from happening. Most of the Kremlin leaders before him, Dmitry Medvedev, Boris Yeltsin, Mikhail Gorbachev, worried about NATO getting too big and too close to Russia, but Putin was essentially the one to make this happen. NATO's expansion in the region has been especially welcomed by the Baltic states, i.e. Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia. But why? Because these states are often quoted as Russia's next targets after Ukraine. But once again, NATO isn't just sitting idly by and letting Russia think the whole of Europe is at its mercy. The alliance is adamant about putting a stop to Russia's reckless antics, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends. So just as NATO has supported Ukraine, the alliance has stood firmly behind the Baltic states. For starters, NATO is sending a permanent German brigade to Lithuania. This brigade will consist of 4,800 soldiers dedicated to defending the country's eastern flank. Canada has also been working on forming a similar brigade in Latvia by 2026. This brigade should consist of 2,200 persistently deployed Canadian Armed Forces members, with the country ready to deploy hundreds more if needed. As for Estonia, its NATO brigade will come from the UK, but its deployment will be at a time of need. These permanent brigades will soon join some 40,000 troops NATO has already deployed in the eastern part of the alliance since Russian aggression began. Granted, these troops are supported by tens of thousands of national troops deployed by each NATO member country in the region. At the moment, NATO's eastern flank consists of 8 distinct battle groups deployed in Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. This means that the area all the way from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south is densely fortified with NATO troops. This is another major blow to Russia, as the country is estimated to have lost nearly 500,000 troops in the war in Ukraine. Sure, the Kremlin has also mobilized 300,000 troops in late 2022 and plans to mobilize another 300,000 by June 2024. But these new soldiers are highly inexperienced and inadequately trained, which essentially means Russia is sending them to their death. Worst of all, Russia is well aware of this. The country's military leadership voluntarily employs the so-called meat grinder strategy that entails soldiers attacking in waves to wear down Ukrainian forces. These soldiers may be successful in doing so, as well as exposing strategic locations to the Russian artillery, but they pay for this success with their lives. Whereas NATO has adopted a strategy focused on deterrence and defense. This approach not only demonstrates the alliance's commitment to collective defense, but also underscores the stark contrast between NATO's values and Russia's brutal tactics. Numbers-wise, NATO collectively has about 2.5 times more active duty soldiers than Russia, 3.39 million versus 1.32 million. However, some Western countries aren't satisfied with the current numbers, especially with the prospect of Russia trying to invade Europe. That's why there's been a lot of talk about making conscription mandatory again. One of the endangered Baltic states, Latvia, has already done so, bringing back compulsory military service in 2023. That said, deterring Russian forces will take much more than just the return of military draft, and NATO is well aware of that. Luckily, NATO is already significantly superior to Russia in essentially all regards – land power, air power, and naval power, as you'll see later in the video. The only aspect where NATO and Russia are more evenly matched is in terms of nuclear weapons. As of 2024, there are over 12,000 total nuclear warheads in the world. Russia alone possesses 5,500 of them. The 3 nuclear forces within NATO, the US, UK, and France, have approximately the same number combined. Of course, the vast majority of these warheads is owned by the US, as many as 5,000, while the UK and France have 225 and 290 respectively. But the issue isn't in the number of nuclear weapons, it's the nuclear doctrine of these opposing sides. NATO's nuclear doctrine is primarily one of deterrence, meaning that these weapons are only intended to prevent conflict rather than escalate it. In contrast, Russia has shown an unparalleled willingness to use nuclear threats as part of its military strategy. In fact, Russia's nuclear weapons, and the country's carelessness about them, have consistently been Putin's strongest bargaining chip in Ukraine. The thinly veiled threats turned into action in May of 2024 when Putin publicly announced tactical nuclear weapons drills in response to Western provocative statements and threats. He has also stashed an unknown number of nuclear weapons in Belarus, which borders 3 NATO members – Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So how has NATO responded to Russia's nuclear coercion? By sticking to its guns, as always. NATO's nuclear deterrence policy has proven successful throughout the Cold War and beyond, on all occasions when the risk of nuclear warfare was at its highest. The deterrence strategy also involves stashing nuclear weapons at secure military bases throughout Europe. As of 2023, 5 NATO member countries – Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey – store over 100 US-owned nuclear weapons. In 2024, this list might expand, as Poland has declared it's ready to host nuclear weapons on its territory if NATO decides to reinforce its eastern flank in this way as well. Since Russia has brought nuclear weapons to Polish borders via Belarus, it's only logical for Poland to react and for NATO to consider bolstering its own nuclear presence in the region. But as important as it was for NATO to show its superiority military-wise, it was also crucial for the alliance to isolate the country internationally. That's where NATO's economic warfare and information warfare tactics come into play. These tactics have a singular goal: to weaken Russia's strategic position and starve the Kremlin's war machine of resources. And that's precisely what they've accomplished. In terms of economic warfare, Russia has been heavily sanctioned since the beginning of the invasion, having over $300 billion of its international assets frozen so far. These sanctions have targeted critical sectors of the Russian economy, including finance, energy, and defense, crippling Russia's ability to sustain its military efforts. The coordinated economic measures have also involved restrictions on Russian banks, limiting their access to international financial systems, and placing embargoes on key exports and imports. Of course, NATO can't take all of the credit for this, as numerous countries outside the alliance have also imposed their own punitive measures against Russia. However, NATO's coordination and leadership have been pivotal in rallying international support and ensuring the sanctions are comprehensive and effective. As of 2024, the total number of sanctions against Russian businesses and people has surpassed 16,500. A significant chunk of these has come from NATO countries, with the US and Canada leading the way with 3,500 and 2,700 sanctions respectively. This just goes to show the amount of power NATO wields once its member countries come together. And it's precisely this unity that's the main reason why Russia will lose against NATO if it ever dares challenge the alliance. If the war in Ukraine has shown one thing, it's that NATO will go above and beyond to protect its members. And remember, Ukraine isn't even a NATO member, so imagine what the alliance would do if one of its own were threatened. With this in mind, let's see how NATO and Russia stack up against each other in terms of military capabilities. But before we start, remember one thing: it's not all about the numbers. Even if Russia does appear powerful in a specific category, quality always trumps quantity. And Russia, for the most part, is relying on aging equipment and infrastructure after failing to properly invest in its military capabilities ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Plus, all the Western sanctions haven't exactly done these capabilities any favors, forcing Russia to scavenge its stocks for outdated technology and cut corners on maintenance and upgrades. NATO, on the other hand, mostly boasts state-of-the-art equipment backed by the latest technological advancements and rigorous maintenance standards. The alliance's investment in cutting-edge technology, from stealth fighter jets to cyber defense systems, ensures its forces are always prepared for modern warfare. Without further ado, let's explore these forces in more detail. First up, military personnel. We've already mentioned the fact that NATO has significantly more active duty troops than Russia, but this superiority also applies to all the other relevant categories. Russia has about 2 million reservists, NATO has over 3.4 million. Russia wields some 250,000 paramilitary units. NATO has almost 800,000. Prior to the war in Ukraine, this vast difference perhaps wouldn't matter as much. Why? Because Russia is known for valuing the professionalism and training of its armed forces. That's why, unlike most Western countries, Russia has had a mandatory conscription system for over 100 years. Most male citizens between 18 and 30 are drafted for a 12-month service. Plus, let's not forget that Russian forces are centralized, unlike NATO's, or at least they were. The war in Ukraine changed everything. Now NATO is the one with the upper hand, having demonstrated its unmatched interoperability on multiple occasions since the start of the invasion. The invasion also had a significant impact on the military budgets of both parties. Russia has never spent more on defense than it plans to in 2024. The country's military spending has risen to an astounding 7.1% of its GDP, which accounts for 35% of total government spending. Yet Russia's military budget still pales in comparison to the combined spending of NATO member countries. To put things into perspective, the US alone spends more on defense than Russia and about 9 more countries on the list of the top military spenders combined. But even if we take the US out of the equation, NATO's European member states still spend more on defense than Russia, at least 2 times more. And with Russia's 2024 military budget reported to be a historic $140 billion, this ratio truly speaks volumes. Though other NATO countries might not have such massive military budgets, they do all try to devote a minimum of 2% of their GDP to defense. This fact once again underscores the unity of NATO and the willingness of each member to pull their weight in the collective defense efforts. Naturally, these efforts primarily rest on strengthening the alliance's aerial, land, and naval resources. So let's see how NATO compares to Russia in this regard. In terms of land power, it's estimated that NATO will be able to deploy more tanks than Russia in the event of conflict. This is a major accomplishment for the alliance, given that Russia is the #1 country in the world by total number of tanks, starting 2024 with over 14,000 vehicles. But let's not forget, Russia is also losing tanks on almost a daily basis. Plus, the tanks that Russia does use on the battlefield were mostly made during the Soviet era, which has led to concerns about their reliability in combat. NATO, on the other hand, has nothing to worry about. Its tank fleet is packed with modern models like the German Leopard 2, British Challenger 2, and French Leclerc, which put most Soviet-designed tanks to shame. A similar sentiment is present when comparing NATO and Russia's aerial resources. According to some estimates, NATO has about 4 to 5 times the aerial resources of Russia. Plus, NATO's fleet includes an impressive array of advanced fighter jets, like the Eurofighter Typhoon, Dassault Rafale, and Saab Gripen. And this is all without even accounting for the US-made superstars like the F-35 Lightning II, which is among the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Combined, these fighter jets provide unparalleled aerial supremacy and multi-role capabilities, allowing NATO to rise to virtually any occasion. As for the naval capabilities, NATO is estimated to have 4 times as many ships as Russia, but the number doesn't even matter as much as the effectiveness of the two navies in combat. Russia's Black Sea Navy, once seen as one of the most formidable in the region, has outright embarrassed itself during the war against Ukraine. So much so that only 1 ship is now estimated to remain in the region, while the rest were damaged, destroyed, or simply sent back to base by Ukraine's clever military tactics. And Ukraine doesn't even have a proper navy. Imagine what NATO's united naval forces could do against such a weakened enemy. All in all, it becomes increasingly clear why going against NATO would be a terrible mistake for Putin. Even more terrible than going after Ukraine in the first place. But remember, it's Putin we're talking about, the same man who seems willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his goals. That's why some experts believe that a direct clash between Russia and NATO might be inevitable. However, most of these experts are still sticking to the fact that NATO's victory over Russia is also inevitable. After all, the security of the whole of Europe hinges on this victory. Of course, this won't make the fight any less ugly, especially when you consider how emboldened Russia has become recently, thanks to the capture of Avdiivka and Pobeda and successful strides toward Bakhmut, Donetsk City, Robotyne, and Kreminna. If Russia defeats Ukraine, a clash with NATO might happen a lot sooner than we imagine. But what do you think? Is the NATO versus Russia battle truly on the cards in the near future? And if so, who do you see winning? But if you believe that the war in Ukraine was enough to deter Russia from any further aggression, we'd be interested to know which NATO move you think made the biggest impact. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Now go and check out why the war in Ukraine shows the US military would destroy the Russian military, or click this other video instead.